be fun, I promise.
Great.
You're watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next 3/4 of an hour, we are going to be going back in time and changing Doctor Who, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
Been prepared.
I mean,
Every goddamn time.
Dylan.
Shall I be Dylan?
Yes,
I'll be
you could be Dylan.
And that'll make me Mark.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to do a what if episode where we're going to change something significant about Doctor Who and discuss what the consequences of that change would be. And so the change I propose is thus. I'm going to propose that Stephen Moffat decided to make the Weeping Angels not out of stone, but of urine and call them Piss Angels. Okay, that's an inside joke that only really makes sense if you heard the last episode of On the Time Lash. Hey, Mark.
Indeed, it wasn't even my joke, but I did give it a good go.
I think I wouldn't say it was even a joke, frankly.
I think I'm right in my assertion that you have to have quite a healthy diet for a weeping angel to be reflected in your stream. But that's stay hydrated out there, ladies and gentlemen. That's what I'll say.
It is dehydrated, so you should definitely stay hydrated. Meanwhile, I'll just be. Oh, I'm sorry. Was I?
My book. What was that book on there? It looks.
Well, it was. It's metamorphosed. It has, in fact, regenerated.
It's degraded.
My copy's downstairs.
What we are going to be discussing is this. And I've obviously known about this, and so has Mark, for a little while. So we can probably talk a little bit while the other two of you get a chance to catch up, unless either of you two has an instant thought, in which case throw it out there. But yes, the subject of this week's episode is what would have happened if. And the question that I landed on was one that I think came up in an old Blue Box podcast a long time ago. And then we never really dug into. So I propose to dig into it now. And the question is this. If at the end of the 10th planet, the end of season 3, the beginning of season 4, wherever it would have happened, because once a change like this happens, the tiny ripples means that everything else doesn't stay quite the same as it would have anyway. What if at the end of the 10th planet, instead of regenerating or renewing the Doctor's body, they just killed William Hartnell off and carried on without him? And that's my question. That's the proposal I'm making now. So unless Dylan or Matt have an immediate thought, well, I think Mark, go on.
I do have an immediate thought, which is, I mean, they kill off the character, so it's just different characters, or are we recasting or anything like that in the same way?
We're not recasting the Doctor. The Doctor dies at the end of the 10th planet.
Oh, then the TV show only lasts another series, then it's done. End of podcast.
I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I mentioned this to Mark the other day when I didn't realise he was going to be on this episode, but he is here now. So ignoring what I said, Mark, what's your initial thought?
It was similar to Dylan's, which is that I don't think the four of us would be sat here discussing Doctor Who today if that had happened, because I think it would have just kind of become like any other kind of, you know, cult TV show of the time, just kind of episodic adventure serial that would have eventually just faded into obscurity. I think
something that would have lasted 3 years and gone, right?
Yeah, because I think the whole thing of Doctor Who is that it is the central question, but also if you kill off the Doctor, who's driving the TARDIS? And that's a whole separate thing you then have to kind of work out.
But see, I've not thought much about this, but I have answers to these questions. And the answers to these questions are there in the very first episode, An Unearthly Child, right? So the question of who's driving the TARDIS is nobody is, just as nobody has been for the past 3 years, because nobody's been able to steer that time ship at all in the entire history of the programme up to that point.
True.
So all it needs is for somebody to press go, and then the TARDIS lands.
It's a bit more complicated than go, though, isn't it?
I don't know. I don't think necessarily it is. But okay, let me lay out my proposal, and then Matt can forensically take it apart, sort of item by item, right? But my initial thought was this: the program starts, and the heroes of the program, the identification characters of the program, are Ian and Barbara. They're the way in, and for the first 2 years, they leave just before the end of 2 years, don't they? For the first 2 years, Ian and Barbara are basically the two characters whose adventures you're following, and the Doctor and Susan and then Vicky are kind of slightly secondary. Okay, the balance changes according to who's on holiday and according to who the writers arrange the stories around, but essentially it's an ensemble piece. And Ian's the hero, Barbara's the heroine, the Doctor is the sort of slightly grumpy, but slightly sort of also slightly twinkling uncle character, and then there's a child character to go with. But the hero and heroine is Barbara and Ian, and that doesn't really change. So although you conflate those two characters into Stephen, and by the end of the program, then you've got Polly and Ben instead, you still basically got that sort of the two heroes of the character are the Earth characters, the two heroes of the series are the Earth characters, and the Doctor, even up as far as the end of William Hartnell, isn't quite the sort of hero of the series, because as you said, the question that's in the name of the series still puts that character slightly to one side, slightly in the background, slightly as a mystery to everybody, and they don't solve any of that mystery for another 3 years after this point, till the War Games. And even when we get to the War Games, they don't solve much of the mystery.
But then surely the problem is, though, that if you kill off William Hartnell, you never answer the... Do you know what I mean? Like, the mystery's gone. Doesn't matter. You're never going to know.
But for audiences in 1966, they don't care anyway, because up till this point, we've barely teased that there's even an idea that we might solve the mystery. The mystery of the character is, who knows where he comes from and who really cares? Up to this point, we look back at it now from a point in the future, and we say, ah, yes, the War Games. We get to visit his planet and see the people that he comes from. And then the Three Doctors, we get to see a bit more of that, and in The Deadly Assassin, a shed load more. It's easy to look back now with hindsight and see these things coming. In 1966, audiences had no idea these things were coming and didn't care. So that's the background to my proposal, but the crux of my proposal is this. Oh, Matt's desperately...
No. I'll just pick up all your sloppy seconds.
Does it become the General Cutler Chronicles? Is that what we're going for here?
No, not quite, but very close. The crux of my proposal is thus: at the end of the 10th planet, the Doctor presses the go button and then dies on the floor of the TARDIS. And at the start of the next story, Ben and Polly are alone in the TARDIS with a dead Doctor. So of course they need to do something. They need to do something to sort this out. Where have they landed? They've landed on the planet Vulcan, where an Earth colony is performing. I mean, the whole point of putting the Daleks in Power of the Daleks is to prove that it's still the same series as the one that had William Hartnell in, right?
Yeah.
You wouldn't change that. But what you would do is you would have an extra character in Power of the Daleks who's the kindly uncle type scientist figure who Ben and Polly can rely on, and who
Lesterson.
No, it's an extra character, and you cast Patrick Troughton to play that character, and at the end of the story, Ben and Polly manage to persuade Patrick Troughton's character to come aboard the TARDIS and try to figure out how to pilot it for them and get them home. And from that point forward, the adventures in Doctor Who carry on just as they would have before, except instead of having another Doctor Who with a different face, you have a different character who essentially takes the same part in the story. Now, I'm not saying this would have been my preferred version of Doctor Who, but what I am saying is it took a real leap of faith at the end of season 3 to start season 4 by casting a new actor as the same character, and most producers wouldn't have done that. They'd have just recast as a different character instead. So I'm just trying to demonstrate how it might have happened that if William Hartnell was leaving and Patrick Troughton was coming in, you could recast as a different character, but essentially still carry on from the same place. Right, Matt.
So I have a variety of thoughts. My first thought is it becomes a bit like the Tomorrow People, without the Doctor. So a bunch of young people traveling around time. I haven't seen much of the Tomorrow People, but a bunch of young people traveling around time, like getting into scrape.
Or Buffy.
Yeah,
You know,
my second
Anthony Head, right?
my second feeling is, and I think this ties in with JR's view, that you can't have Doctor Who for long without a Doctor Who-ish figure. That at some point, and because it's just the way that the narrative works, at some point you have to have a smart older character, not Ian and not Barbara, but somebody who's familiar with the process that they're going through. My third thought is, I think the mystery of the Doctor could very easily be replaced by the mystery of where does the TARDIS come from? How does the TARDIS work?
Well,
what's the origin of the TARDIS?
Yeah, I was going to say, at some point, instead of having the War Games, you have the story where the TARDIS accidentally lands on its home planet, and they emerge from the TARDIS to find it surrounded by other TARDISes.
And my fourth thought is sort of goes against the whole premise of the idea. I don't think they'd kill off the Doctor. I think the Doctor would go missing in time, and the whole premise would be this bunch of Tomorrow People, young people, have to hunt down the Doctor. Whether they find him or not is a moot point. I think that would last for like a run of episodes, and then you'd get a replacement character, and eventually the hunt for this original Doctor would kind of peter out.
Or you'd find him and cast as somebody else, earlier in his timeline maybe, or something, who knows.
Yeah, so somehow the idea of having a dead William Hartnell on board the TARDIS and then having to do something about him on Vulcan, that, as Mark suggests, that's a little bit macabre. And who knows, William Hartnell might have been happy to get paid for portraying a cadaver and Doctor Who.
Oh my God, he'd be in a bag or covered in the sheet or something.
Yeah,
you wouldn't even need William Hartnell.
Much less macabre.
Do you know what I mean, though? You could. There's ways
Michael
you could do it,
Craze, Michael Craze was just a body bag slung over his shoulder. It's not exactly kids' TV in the 1960s, is it? It's maybe kids' TV presenters in the 1970s. But
the real question is, would it then last beyond Patrick Troughton?
Well, it almost didn't in the way that things did go. So I think possibly not. I think that might have been actually the end of it, because I think what regeneration gives you is a way out, because surely you can only kind of keep just handing over this magical machine to somebody else, only so many times.
Yes, you would. But in effect, that's not so very different from what we've got now. So the question really becomes, does the premise itself hold up of having a kind of anthology series where you've got a different location, a different dilemma, a different alien species every 4 or 6 weeks? And do you know what? I think the premise basically does hold up.
Didn't work for sliders, did it?
Well, but without the TARDIS, I think it becomes more difficult. But look at something like Stargate. Stargate developed into 2 spin-off series and ran for 10 years or something. So it worked well enough there. So it's not like the premise itself doesn't work. I mean, the reason why I brought it up is, there but for the grace of God, we could have lost William Hartnell and not had Patrick Troughton cast as Doctor Who. So I'm just trying to imagine how things might have gone. Shall I move on to the second phase then? Because I
was going to just say that
the second phase kind of carries on from the first phase. So
because I'm going to go back a little bit.
Okay, yeah,
but
sure.
When they were making the Celestial Toymaker, was the whole plan not that the Toymaker would make the first Doctor go invisible, and then when he would come back, he'd be played by somebody else to get rid of William Hartnell? But then that never went anywhere. So they're already thinking about changing the face rather than changing the character.
Yes.
But it's that James Bond thing of sort of it would have been a Hartnell-esque figure, not like a brand new thing. I think that's the thinking. Which I suppose the what if there is, if it was just recasting as another elderly doddery man, how long does the show last? And again, probably until about 1970.
I think there's also a case to be made that, unlike a lot of other television series, and I'm thinking of American television, Doctor Who, once you get past the popularity of the Daleks and the sci-fi stuff, it relies on an eccentricity and it relies on a charismatic central performance up until Colin Baker, and then it relies on a charismatic central performance that embodies some degree of English eccentricity, and I think which then connects to the time. So it has to be sort of the fact that it can change the main character every 3 or 4 years. They kind of update him so that they make him more pertinent to his time, and that's one of the keys to the longevity of the series, I think.
You wouldn't really lose that though, because you'd cast somebody like Patrick Troughton as a central sort of uncle type figure, and then when he left, you'd cast somebody else, potentially John Pertwee.
The problem with that though is that I think Matt's absolutely right in the sense that it updates it, but it keeps a core kind of ideal of what that character is.
Yeah,
and you can see a kind of history. Whereas I think if you're constantly just handing the ship over to a different person who's a little bit like the last guy, but a bit more without a science fiction explanation.
You say that, but you look at Tom Baker, Peter Davison, Colin Baker, they deliberately didn't go for somebody who was like the last guy. They deliberately went as different as they possibly could get away with. But it's still the same guy. Yeah. Well, that's what I'm saying. I think you'd have a series of sort of like professorial characters, but each one would be very different. And so essentially you could have Troughton, Pertwee, Tom Baker, Peter Davison, whatever. They'd just be the professors who get. I mean, it's not ideal, and it probably wouldn't have lasted. But I'm just trying to imagine.
There's an irony that regeneration, the physical transformation of an individual, it's slightly more palatable, and there's slightly less suspension of disbelief than simply finding another new character by chance on another planet that just happens to be very similar to that fulfills the role of the Doctor. So that's a slightly bigger stretch. So after 7 or 8 times, it'll start becoming an in-joke in the series.
But yes, and it probably wouldn't have lasted as long. And I think my thinking is the producers, faced with the dilemma of losing William Hartnell, and let's suppose they didn't have the imagination to change him to a different actor playing the same character, they'd be desperately fishing around for, well, what could we do instead if we want to keep this program going? And Patrick Troughton as a scientist on the planet Vulcan who comes in and tries to work out how the TARDIS works, which nobody else ever has anyway, it seems to me that's as plausible a route they could have taken as any. Meanwhile, I don't know what Matt's doing, but he's sort of trying to put us off. I think I'm getting the.
Sorry, I'm getting ready for phase 2.
Phase 2 is slightly different, but it's not much further down the line. So at the end, because it's Barry Letts who introduces the concept of regeneration, they change William Hartnell into Patrick Troughton. They call it Renewal, and we forget this at the end of the War Games. They don't regenerate Patrick Troughton. They don't even renew Patrick Troughton. The Time Lords forcibly change him. That's not even a self-regeneration. That's one that's caused from outside. That shouldn't even really count when we count the number of incarnations.
That's what I don't forget it. I remember it.
I mean, in general, we forget this. What I mean is, in general, fandom counts the Troughton into Pertwee as a regular regeneration as part of the series, but it's not.
The first traditional regeneration is Tom Baker into Peter Davison,
because that's the first one after they've worked out how it works.
No, because Pertwee into Tom Baker was helped along by the.
Oh, I see what you mean.
So actually,
Baker into Davison is helped along by the Watcher.
So actually, if you follow this logic, the first traditional regeneration may even have been the carrot juice one.
Well, the third and fourth are helped along.
Yeah.
The third and fourth are helped along, but it's only Troughton into Pertwee that's kind of triggered from outside. Yeah. That's the one that's forced into happening. And here's the thing. So when Hartnell renews into Patrick Troughton, I don't think there's any suggestion at that time or it's written in afterwards in the story afterwards, but it's not presented as such that this is a natural change that's going to be a reoccurring thing. And I think there's dialogue at the start of Patrick Troughton that talks about the chrysalis and the butterfly and the pupa, but a pupa only changes into a chrysalis and becomes a butterfly once. It's not something that keeps on occurring throughout the butterfly's lifespan. It happens once and that's it. And then the thing is, at the end of the War Games, they push it into happening. So again, it's not a natural process there. So the natural process, by the time you get to John Pertwee, has only happened one time. And the time when Pertwee changes into Tom Baker is the only time when it naturally gets triggered again. That's the first time we naturally see it triggering as part of an ongoing process. So back in 1969, there was no notion that regeneration would either be something called regeneration or would be something that would continually trigger as an ongoing process. So here's the second part of my sort of premise. What if they'd got to the end of the War Games, such as the War Games would be, because it would have been a differently written story, or the last episode at least would have been very different if we'd have gone with this scenario. But what if we'd have gone to the end of the War Games and Patrick Troughton had said, right, my contract's up, I'm out. And the producers of Doctor Who, being entirely different people from the ones who'd been there when the 10th Planet had been there, had said, right, well, the Time Lords either have the Doctor back and put him in prison, or they kill him off, or whatever, and the episode ends with the TARDIS dematerializing of its own volition, either with Jamie and Zoe inside it or not. And the cliffhanger at the end of the War Games is it rematerializes on Earth, I don't know, outside in the woods outside Unit HQ. We've already met the Brigadier by this point, of course. So here's the second part of the premise. What if the TARDIS turns up either with Zoe and Jamie inside or with nobody inside at all at the start of season 7? And what if season 7 had started without a Doctor? So I don't know, do you want me to throw a thought out there before or does anybody have any initial thoughts they want to throw in immediately?
So just can we just clarify something? I presume literally the only thing that has changed is that. So the production team.
Well, the production team changes at that point anyway.
Well, it kind of doesn't. It doesn't because Derek Sherman kind of sets up a bunch of stuff. He's kind of there for the first couple of serials.
Yeah.
And obviously everybody through the Troughton era is the same. So BBC production staff has kind of remained the same, attached to Doctor Who.
Do you want me to carry on with my thought then? Because I had a little bit of a thought about this, and I might as well say what my thought was, and then you can say how you would differ or whatever. But yes, Derek Sherwin sets up Doctor Who on Earth for one more season, and it's supposed to be killed off after that season anyway, but that season proves too popular and they can't find anything else to replace it with anyway, so they carry on. But season 7 is supposed to be the last season of Doctor Who. So in my scenario, imagine that Sherwin wants to persuade Troughton to stay on for one last season before he quits and the series is finished anyway. So this will be the last season of Doctor Who, and to save money, because it's going into colour, it's all going to take place on planet Earth. So there'll be 4 stories on planet Earth with Patrick Troughton, and because Troughton stayed on, they kept Jamie and Zoe, but they've also got the Brigadier, and there are no other regular members of Unit by this point anyway, because there's only Barry Letts who asked the actor John Levine even to stay on between stories. That means Benton's become a regular by the end of the series, otherwise it would just be the Brigadier. So here's my thought. I'm thinking if Sherwin's setting this up without Troughton, he also gets rid of Jamie and Zoe. He sends the TARDIS to Earth by itself. The Brigadier is already in play. We've seen him twice already in the Web of Fear and in the Invasion. So Unit is a thing. So the story at that point becomes like a cross between what is this magical device and, let's say, Liz and or somebody else, a pair of scientific advisors to Unit, want to investigate the TARDIS to find out how it works, to kind of see what they can get out of it, to find out what benefits there are. But you cross this with, I guess, Torchwood / Boomtown. Just the premise of that being the TARDIS has come to Earth, and so either through some form of osmosis or by deliberate design, the aliens follow it. So Earth in 1970 in season 7 becomes fodder for alien invasions. You've got the Brigadier and Unit. You've got a TARDIS that is not been disabled by the Time Lords, so ostensibly still could work if somebody could get it working. And you've got Liz Shaw and or another scientific advisor trying to work out how the TARDIS works at the same time as dealing with alien invasions alongside the Brigadier. So it's not massively different, but what happens is Doctor Who in the 1960s is a program about a wandering alien, and Derek Sherwin's almost set this up anyway. Doctor Who in the 70s is about a crack platoon of soldiers dealing with alien invasions from outer space. It's not a million miles away. All you've done is you've not got John Pertwee there.
I mean, my feeling is that UNIT would very quickly hire a scientific advisor, but very like John Pertwee, to deal with things. Once again, I think the series has a natural void, and I agree that the TARDIS does replace the Doctor in terms of a degree of mystery. And actually, there's something quite nice about the idea of humans trying to make the TARDIS work, and actually makes Inferno more likely, because humans will get the TARDIS wrong and it'll go to extremes and blah de blah. So I mean it's basically Doom Watch Quatermass.
Yeah, but that was what was in the water anyway, right?
I do think it's an interesting concept of the mystery of the ship, but I don't think you're getting more than 4 or 5 episodes out of it, because it's not the sort of thing where it's like, oh, we need to figure out how this thing works, and then it's going to somehow solve every problem that they come up against, because it's not a battleship or something like that. It's not the Millennium Falcon.
When you say 4 or 5 episodes, you mean 4 or 5 stories?
Oh no, I mean 4 or 5 episodes. I don't think it could.
But that's the point. In most of the episodes, you wouldn't see it. It would be just something that would turn up every now and again, either as a story point or just to keep the audience aware of the fact that it's still there and they're still trying to figure out how it works.
What they probably do is get John Leeson in to give it a voice, like Kit in Knight Rider, or Ulrach in whatever that was.
Yeah. And also, I think you'd run the risk of, obviously, it's, you've had Patrick Troughton obviously not being Doctor Who in this scenario, but being a, professor character, having 2 scientific advisors working on a machine that can't take them anywhere, while aliens are kind of invading the home counties, feels like a very different. I mean, obviously, the Pertwee, that first season of Pertwee does feel like a very different show, but I think it gets away with it because it's the Doctor, and you've got his relationship with the Brigadier, and it sells it to the audience that, well, this is just what Doctor Who is now. He drives a yellow car, and the TARDIS just sits in an office somewhere. Whereas I think if it's just a blue box in the corner of a room and some scientists you've never met before, I do think it's like, well, why aren't we just doing a new sci-fi show about a crack military organization?
Otherwise, all your characters are dead.
Well, yeah, Barry Letts realised anyway, isn't it? After season 7, he realised that actually they'd shot themselves in the foot by having him stranded on Earth, because you lose a good 2/3 of Doctor Who.
Sure, because that is basically what you've just described, is basically what Derek Sherwin was trying to set up anyway, really, isn't it? So it's kind of, I'm just taking what Derek Sherwin was already doing and just pushing it that one step further. And of course, again, I go back to the point of, from this perspective, where we've seen the whole of the classic series and we saw what happened next, it's easy to say, oh yeah, they put him on Earth, but he was never going to stay there. And by season 8, they're already giving him stories in outer space. And, by season 9, there's 2 stories in outer space for 3 on Earth and or whatever. But in 1970, audiences didn't know that. And so a show where the TARDIS stays, because remember already the Doctor's changed once. And for audiences in the 1960s, when the Doctor changes his face, that effectively really is a new person, really, to them. It's not like we see it when we've seen 5 or 6 Doctors, or 9 or 10 or 13 or 14 Doctors, where it just becomes passé for the Doctor to change face. For audiences in the 1960s, to have 2 different Doctors was to have 2 different people leading the show. And so the version in 1970 becomes the show as led by Alistair Gordon Lethbridge Stewart. So not a million miles away. And I think if you'd have sold audiences that first series, then that concept may have had some legs. I don't know. It could have been a situation where the TARDIS comes to Earth and then we discover the Doctor didn't die, and maybe the Doctor comes back after about 3 or 4 years anyway to be reunited with the TARDIS. I don't know. I'm just trying to extrapolate a premise for 1970.
That would be my view. Would be the 1971 series would be really interesting, because you could have a 1970 series, a series 7, without the Doctor, assuming the Doctor is in prison on Gallifrey somewhere, and then 1971 opens with a Spearhead from Space like story where the Doctor arrives in a completely new body. You don't know it as a viewer, the Brigadier doesn't know it, and we've spent time with the Brigadier, so now the Brigadier is the identification character.
Yeah.
And suddenly you get John Pertwee as this weird alien, and gradually you come to realise that actually this is the Doctor after all, who's had his face changed and then just dropped to Earth. And then you have to get used to that with the Brigadier. It actually makes Spearhead from Space slightly more interesting, because as it is, Spearhead from Space, you don't really have an identification character in that, because you know more than the Brigadier, more than Liz Shaw, and you know more than the Doctor as well.
And you don't really see it from the Brigadier's eyes quite either, do you? You see it from Liz Shaw's eyes initially. So it's a bit like Rose when Russell T Davies brings the series back, that Liz Shaw is essentially the identification character for the first episode. And then that slips by the by as well, actually, after the first 25 minutes, doesn't it, I think? Do you want to go on? Oh, go on.
I was just going to say, this absence of the Doctor pitch is not too far away from what Dan Friedman, who did Death Comes to Time, where he famously killed off the Doctor at the end, his pitch for a TV show was The Doctor's dead, Doctor Who The Next Generation with the Minister, played by Stephen Fry, which is basically the Doctor. And then at some point, a couple of seasons down the line, the Doctor is resurrected. So it comes back to the thing of, as with every version of this, you need the character of the Doctor or somebody like the Doctor. Turns out, I know it's a what if, but it turns out it just doesn't work, does it?
Well, but the other side of that coin is, what is Torchwood and what is the Sarah Jane Adventures if not Doctor Who without the Doctor? And they both.
But then also 30 years later, with with a very, very popular show behind it, rather than a show that was on its arse. The 60s kind of came to an end, you know.
But you know what I mean?
And the Doctor then turns up in them.
Yeah. Well, the Doctor does, but that's the Doctor's not a necessary character in them. I mean, they could have lived without the Doctor showing up. As Sarah Jane, of course, the Doctor doesn't show up in Torchwood, and Torchwood only got nixed really because Russell T Davies was having personal problems, wasn't he? Otherwise, it would have carried on, because the viewing figures for the fourth series were good. It would have carried on for a fifth.
Also, isn't Jack basically the Doctor, but a bit more of a sex pest?
And Sarah Jane's the Doctor, but a bit more of a schoolmarm.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the other point in the Me Too environment. Changing the lead actor is a safe thing to do. Basically, having a lead character whose face can change every 3 or 4 years means that, because let's face it, cut this out if it's litigious. If Tom Baker's the Doctor right now in his 40s, then there would absolutely be a Me Too situation in terms of power struggles and his business with fans. See also, no.
Right, let's move on quickly from that. But speaking of
Tom Baker, get me started on William Hartnell.
Speaking of Tom Baker, I'm going to move to the third part of this premise, which does move us on a bit. And I'm going to, Matt, you better put your fingers in your ears, because I'm going to bring up something you don't like. I'm going to go back to my idea, and it's not actually, as it turns out, a unique idea. I'd never heard it before.
Well,
but
this isn't how Skaro is called Scary Planet rather than Scarred Planet, is it?
No.
Okay.
This is how in the Brain of Morbius we get to see that there are 12 different Doctors, and in the Deadly Assassin there's a line of dialogue. And actually, I watched this afterwards, and the line of dialogue is presented as if the characters, 2 old Time Lords, sitting down waiting to get changed. The way they're talking about it is as if when they say regenerations, they mean incarnations. In other words, 12 people as opposed to 12 changes. In other words, I suggested that Robert Holmes had intended for Tom Baker to be the last Doctor. And if Robert Holmes had stayed till the end of Tom Baker's tenure, Robert Holmes as a writer would have been able to address that. And at the time he was writing The Deadly Assassin, he probably assumed that he would stay till the end of season 15, and Tom Baker, after 4 years in a role, would probably leave at the end of season 15. So Robert Holmes would probably get to solve that problem at the end of season 15. As it transpired, Holmes left early, Baker stayed on a lot longer, and things didn't work out. But here's my proposal. What if you'd got to the end of season 15 and Robert Holmes had killed off the Doctor? Would Doctor Who stop there? Or given that you just had 4 years of unparalleled ratings, would the powers that be at the BBC have done something to try and keep the series going? And okay, again, I wrote this question before we started, so I'm just going to throw an idea out there. And this is not an ideal idea by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm going to propose a gender swap, because Hinchcliffe and Holmes stay on to the end of season 15, which is what initially they were planning to do. They leave together with Tom Baker. Graham Williams comes in at the start of season 16, does his key to time idea, but with no Doctor there, the series is now led by a female Time Lord called Romana.
I mean, for me, the block in this is the assumption that Robert Holmes or even Philip Hinchcliffe have enough power to kill off the central character of the series.
They wouldn't, but I'm just asking what
we've run into. I mean, setting aside, I don't like the idea of the theory that Robert Holmes planned for it to be the last Doctor, because I'm pretty sure they just got as many crew members as possible to give photographs, and I don't think they were actually counting.
Yes, I bet they did, but then afterwards Robert Holmes counts how many they used and puts that number in The Deadly Assassin and says, there's your limit.
Oh, okay.
It could be that Stephen Moffat thing though, where he goes, "Oh, everybody has a number that they just pick to exaggerate things." So maybe he just went for 13.
Okay, yeah, sure, but the point is not what the number is. The point is, what if Robert Holmes had killed the Doctor off?
I do think it's, if you're going for the Romana thing, I do think it's the only point and the only character that you could swap in as a replacement, because Romana is just that female Doctor anyway.
Plus, she's a bit of a sort of by the rules, just out of school stickler. You get her in and you get somebody in like, I don't know, just choosing an example from the same series, Drax, to play opposite her. So he plays this sort of Cockney wide boy Time Lord who she picks up sort of 10 minutes into the first episode of the first story. And so you've still got that dynamic in the TARDIS. In fact, actually, that dynamic in the TARDIS might have worked better than the dynamic between the first Romana and Tom Baker, possibly.
I mean, the Cockney wide boy and the strong female lead is just Jodie Whittaker's first 2 seasons, isn't it?
I mean, I guess the question is, so I agree that Romana would be a suitable replacement for the Doctor. My question is, what happens when John Nathan Turner takes over, assuming the inevitable path of history keeps flowing as it would.
Well, I like to think
I'm not sure John Nathan Turner would be able to get his head around a strong female lead.
I like to think that if this series of events had happened, the butterfly effect would be that instead of John Nathan Turner, you get George Galaccio off the Omega Factor instead. And let's face it, that was Louise Jameson and forget the actor's name, but that was a strong pair, a male and a female lead, a very strong pair of leads who worked well together in the Omega Factor. So I don't know, I like to think that's what would have happened. And of course, Romana is somebody who can regenerate again. So you get to the end of the Doctor's regenerations, but Romana's just at the beginning of hers. I don't know, that kind of, I don't think it works as well, but I think if you throw in a character like Dax, I think it's not so very far off. I think you lose the Doctor, though. You probably lose the interest of a lot of people, so the viewing figures probably do go down a lot quicker.
I think also you're underestimating Tom Baker's ego. That he would leave with Philip Hinchcliffe and Robert Holmes. I think no. I think it takes John Nathan Turner to sort of, force Baker out by the end.
But I think the sort of crucial thing here is Tom Baker's ego takes off when Graham Williams gets flown in at the start of season 15.
Yeah.
I don't think he's
True,
got
yeah.
that ego when Hinchcliffe is the producer.
Because he
I think
feels like he's the sort of still marshalling the show that he always kind of
Yeah.
wanted.
So I think it's more
He might not
plausible
have
that
the
he
ego,
leaves
but
together. Yeah.
He still has a fairly strong desire to earn a weekly paycheck.
Well,
At this point,
Yes.
is there any form of what if that means we wouldn't get Adric?
hang on.
George,
It's the
I think
fourth
we've
part
already
of this
covered that with
equation.
JNT not being.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know George Galaccio would have done. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but that seems correct. I think he'd have done something very different to what JNT did. JNT went very much into the sort of glitz and the glamour. Galaccio would have gone much more into the sort of grit. Doctor Who would have looked and felt much more like Blake Seven, really. I think under Galaccio.
He'd have filmed this in Edinburgh.
Who knows? Maybe.
They should film Doctor in Edinburgh. Everything else films in bloody Edinburgh these days.
They should stick to small villages in Wiltshire every time, every episode.
Or Cardiff, done up to look like any city anywhere in the world.
And if it means putting a big piece of green screen up in Oldbourne, they should always go to Oldbourne.
Right, guys, I've come up with 3 points at which the Doctor could have permanently departed instead of just changing her face. Are there any more in the classic series where we can think there's a point at which the Doctor might have left altogether?
Well, Trial of a Time Lord.
Yeah.
But then I suppose that would have been the end of the whole show. But that was the plan, wasn't it? The cliffhanger ending where they go off the edge of the cliff and do they come back? No, they probably don't.
Not at that point, no.
Yeah.
But in an ideal world, if things hadn't been going so badly, you could have done something like Trial of a Time Lord and reinvented the series somehow afterwards. So that could be a point at which there is a reinvention. What do we think about Peter Davison? Because he says, "Oh, it feels different this time." That would have been.
There is a case for that it does. It's the one minor good thing about Twin Dilemma is Colin Baker is so different from Peter Davison. There is a feeling that it's been different this time and something's gone wrong and this might not be the Doctor. If they'd have done that a bit more subtly and kind of not shown the regeneration, then there would have been that kind of tension in the Twin Dilemma.
Especially if, instead of casting Colin Baker, they'd have had Peter Davison change into Miriam Margolyes.
I've got a moment.
Mordrin I don't want to know about your moment.
Mordrin undead.
Oh yes.
Someone offs Davo, and we're left with Mordrin, old spaghetti head as the lead. That's it.
Nice. I think that's probably the point at which we should definitely knock this thing on the head.
Why? All the companions believed that I was the Doctor.
That's true. The Brigadier believes it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh my God. Yeah, let's not go back to the idea of Mordrin undead because you're giving me nightmares just thinking about all that stuff. I don't know. So that was the initial what if. Next time we'll talk about what if, I don't know, Ridley Scott hadn't been on holiday the week they needed somebody to design the Daleks.
They probably would have looked shit.
They probably would have looked shit, and things would have been very different, right?
People always discuss that like it wasn't H.R. Geiger who came up with the whole look of the aliens.
Yeah, quite. Well, and does that not mean that Doctor Who would have finished after like the first year? And then in the 1980s, there'd have been a cult remake that went out on BBC Two at 6:30 in half-hour episodes, made on a budget of threepence halfpenny, that made the original look brilliant. You know, and this.
Or Tim Burton would have made a movie of it in the mid-90s and we all would have loved it.
Yeah, we'd have loved it like we love everything else Tim Burton does, right? Right, until we do this again. I was JR.
I was Dylan.
I was Mark.
And we will speak again soon.